Well, end of 7 days, not much has changed. I guess. McClellan was holed up in a place called Harrison's Landing and showed no real inclination of moving on. Lee was up above him. Um, Lee certainly didn't have the troops to attack Harrison's Landing. McClellan was well dug in and had the U.S. Navy behind him, so probably not a good place to attack. At one point, Lincoln comes down to Harrison's Landing to see if he can get McClellan to move, and McClellan basically indicates that maybe someday I'll move. So none of this works out very well from the Union point of view. Lee's got an interesting problem, though. Do you remember those 50,000 troops that were chasing Jackson out in the valley? Lincoln has pulled them back together near Washington, a very good military maneuver, and created a new army called the Army of Virginia. And he's appointed as its commanding general a fellow from the West who you've never heard of before, and frankly, we'll never hear of again, by the name of John Pope. Pope believed fairly strongly that he could whip Robert E. Lee. He was probably not going to be right in that estimation, but he was going to go ahead and do it. Yeah. Lee realized that he was stuck between Pope with 50,000 troops to his north and McClellan, who probably had about 80,000 troops to his south. Lee may have had 70,000 troops. In any instance, he had to do something about the fact that he's caught between two armies, and also he wanted to get the Army of Virginia, that army under Pope, out of Northern Virginia so that the farmers could harvest their crops. Confederates are always short on supplies, and he needs to get that army out of there. So the first thing he does was he sends Jackson with about a sixth of his troops, that's about a sixth of Lee's troops, north to, tap on Pope and see what's going on. Now, it turns out that Pope is, more than welcome to be tapped on, and he sends a fellow by the name of Banks, whom Jackson had fought repeatedly out in the Shenandoah Valley, down to deal with Mr. Jackson. The two of them lock up in a battle on August 9th called Cedar Mountain or Slaughter Mountain. And the whole thing becomes a slugfest. It's not Jackson's best battle by any means. He does at one point rally his troops right in the middle of a gunfire, but it was conducted in the middle of a heat wave, and things just simply went wrong. Jackson once again fell asleep in mid-afternoon, and Jackson did seem to need more sleep than most people do, for whatever reason. Eventually, Jackson wins the Battle of Cedar Mountain, but now Pope really has a good idea of where Jackson is, and Pope pulls back behind the rivers. For once, the rivers help the north. Lee, watching McClellan, realizes that McClellan's pretty unlikely to attack Richmond, and in fact, he may be going home. And so Lee now is struck with another problem. If McClellan and Pope join forces, there's going to be about 150,000 troops, Northern troops, poised to move toward Richmond. Lee doesn't begin to have that. I doubt that he has half the number. So he's got to suppress, to use a term that Lee used, he's got to suppress Pope. And so now he's going to move his army northward. And you can see there's a series of maneuvers here. Pope handles his army fairly well, uses the rivers to protect himself. Lee can't get at Pope, and he's got to come up with some means of doing so. And that's when he realizes that there's a small range of mountains right here. It's Jackson, who can move quickly, could, at least theoretically, move northward and essentially past Pope, down and come in behind him. Okay, well, Jackson's the guy to do that. And so that's what happens, is he sends Jackson on this huge march, about 50 miles long. And the next thing Pope knows, Pope's in here, is that Jackson has exploded on top of his supply lines back behind him. Seized his supplies, not that that matters a whole bunch to the north. They're going to be able to replace them, but still he seized his supplies, wrecked the railroad, did all kinds of unpleasant things, and then Jackson faded away to the north. Pope, and this is a sign of a bad general, Pope turns around, focuses on Jackson, and essentially tries to catch him. The trouble with that particular idea is you've just forgotten that Robert E. Lee is sitting behind you. Jackson and Pope end up in this position here. This is on the battlefield of Second Bull Run or Second Manassas, same place where the first battle, Bull Run. There's a railroad cut here. I have stood in this, and even today, 150 years later, you can tell that it's still a sizable object to get across. Pope's forces have to cross this railroad cut and go uphill, and then all the time Jackson's forces are shooting at you. Probably not a very easy thing to do. Pope but threw his troops at Jackson here on the late afternoon of August 29th, and not noticing that Lee had not been quiet behind him. And in fact, he had followed the same path Jackson had followed, and now has got his troops under the command of General James Longstreet, probably one of the greater generals of the war, certainly one of the greater generals of the war, a man who with a real ability to get his troops in line and get them to throw a terrific punch. Without really knowing that Longstreet is out here, Pope, and not checking. Now, some of Pope's commanders knew that Longstreet was out there. It didn't matter because Pope wasn't listening. So Pope tries to attack here, and Jackson simply beats back Pope's attempts to get to him. The next day, Pope comes to and says, you know what, those Confederates are fleeing. And there's some reason to believe that, because some of these troops in here had gotten into a fight, just sheer friction of war. Some of these Confederate troops in here had gotten in a fight with some of the Union troops here, and they had pulled back. So to Pope, he thought, Jackson is retreating. And in fact, he sends a message to Washington saying, I'm going to pursue them. Never thinking that Jackson might not be retreating. And certainly not taking the time to do the kind of survey, the reconnaissance that you need in order to do that. The end result, therefore, is that if we take a look at the positions at 3 o'clock on August 30th, 1862, Pope's army is here. Jackson's troops are here. Longstreet's troops are here. You can see what's about to happen. They're going to, if Jackson swings this way and Longstreet swings this way, the Northern Army is caught squarely between two really good generals with a lot of really good troops. And so this is about 3 o'clock on August 30th. Pope thought he was pursuing Jackson. And instead, when he tried to pursue him, they ran into sheets of fire coming from Jackson's position. And Pope gave it everything he had. At one point, Jackson actually has to turn to Longstreet. I don't think the two liked each other very much. And said, basically, he has sent a message to Longstreet asking for help. And Longstreet says, basically, what, I'm over here, and my artillery will bust up the attack on you before I can send troops, which is exactly what happened. And then about 4:30 on August 30th, 1862, and again, times are approximate, just like numbers of troops are approximate. Longstreet moves his troops forward. As Longstreet's troops move forward, Jackson's troops move forward. There's a really stout Union defense here along a place called Chin Ridge, and but it's way too late. Pope has completely mishandled this thing. He didn't do the proper reconnaissance. He didn't listen to the generals who knew who had seen Longstreet come down on him. He had focused on Jackson and not thought about Lee, which of course was very foolish to do. And the end result, therefore, is just a complete disaster. And we, from the Union point of view, and we move into the Antietam Campaign, which will lead us to the Bloody Day stay in the Western Hemisphere. You're not likely to ever see a day quite this bad again, at least not in our lifetime. And if we do, I'm not sure I want to be around to see it. Anyway, take care. And despite the bloodiness of this particular video, let's move on to the next one, the Antietam Campaign. Take care.